Hello, everybody. Born on April 13th, 1743, Thomas Jefferson was to become the man known for penning the Declaration of Independence. He later served as the French diplomat and as the third president of the United States from 1801 to 1809. Jefferson was a staunch Democratic Republican who valued liberty and detested controversy. This is a personality trait that actually has a lot of sway in his political decisions, so keep that in mind. His hatred of this controversy led him to invite two feuding rivals and friends of his, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, to a private dinner party. These men were locked in a debate about assumption of state debts by the federal government. So the federal government was basically going to assume all the state's debts in order to be able to pay them off. So Jefferson knew that a resolution, and a fast resolution, was of utmost importance to the stability of the young nation. So he hatched himself an idea. And his idea was that he was going to invite them to a dinner party. So he says, "On considering the situation of things, I thought the first step towards conciliation of views would be to bring Mr. Madison and Colonel Hamilton to a friendly discussion of the subject." So his wording, friendly discussion of the subject, really exemplifies his hatred of conflict. He didn't want this to be an argument. He wanted this to be a friendly discussion. So Jefferson decided that the dinner party may help resolve the subject, which was assumption. And what was to be struck at this dinner party was to have far-reaching consequences, as implied by Jefferson in his account of the evening. They came. I opened the subject to them, the subject being assumption, acknowledged that my situation had not permitted me to understand it sufficiently, but encouraged them to consider the thing together. They did so. It ended in Mr. Madison's acquiescence in a proposition that the question of assumption should be again brought before the House by way of amendment from the Senate, that he would not vote for it, nor entirely withdraw his opposition, yet he would not be strenuous, but to leave it to its fate. So he decided that he was not going to wage this war in legislation and try to get everyone to vote against this assumption bill. They decided that they would trade the seat of government and move it to the Potomac for Madison's relaxation of his defense against the assumption bill, which Hamilton obviously supported and created. He continues, "It was observed, I forget by which of them, that as the pill would be a bitter one for the southern states, something should be done to soothe them, and a removal of the government to the Potomac, of the seat of government to the Potomac, was just a measure, and would probably be a popular one with them, and would be a proper one to follow assumption." So what he's saying here is that this is the nature of the deal. They were going to trade the seat of the government to the Potomac, and in exchange, hopefully, assumption would get passed. It would be left to its fate. I would not be actively defended against. And so you can see where Jefferson's avoidance of confrontation has played into this kind of a compromise, which has lasting implications for our country. So the implications of this deal by Jefferson are huge. National assumption of state debts essentially acknowledged that the federal government had a right to tax the states and that they had ultimate jurisdiction over the states. Which obviously was a hotbed issue. The southern states especially did not want to trade a foreign government in Parliament for a foreign government here on the continent. It was no different to them. As later noted by Jefferson, the consequences had little to do with the Residence Bill and everything to do with assumptions. So this really had nothing to do with where the seat of government was going to be. It was all about the powers implied by the Assumption Bill, the fact that the federal government now could assume state debts, and this was a problem because on a deeper financial level, the speculators, as they called them, they stood to benefit, and they stood to really influence politics in government because of their incentive in investing in U.S. government debt. Two years following the passing of the Assumption Bill, Jefferson explains his woes to George Washington. In a letter he wrote, it's titled Conflict with Hamilton, written September 9th, 1792. I now take the liberty of proceeding to that part of your letter wherein you notice the internal dissensions which have taken place without our government, and their disagreeable effect on its movements. That such dissensions have taken place is certain, and even among those who are nearest to you in the administration. So Jefferson is really talking about Hamilton in this case. And you'll see that later on in this letter. To no one have they given deeper concern than to myself. To no one equal mortification at being myself a part of them. So he is expressing his regret for being a part of this deal. Though I take to myself no more than my share of the personal observations of your letter, yet I am so desirous ever that you should know the whole truth, and believe no more than the truth, that I am glad to seize every occasion of developing to you whatever I do or think with regards to government, and shall therefore ask permission to be more lengthy now than the occasion particularly calls for, or could otherwise perhaps justify. Talk about being lengthy. I mean, that introduction's lengthy, but this is the nature of Jefferson's writing. He's asking George why. He doesn't want to, again, start any confrontation. He wants to ask permission, be respectful, and go on, proceed to tell George Washington what is going on. He continues. When I embarked in the government, it was with the determination to intermeddle not at all with the legislature and as little as possible with my co-departments. The first and only instance of variance from the former part of my resolution I was duped into by the Secretary of the Treasury and made a tool for forwarding his schemes, not then sufficiently understood by me. So what he's saying is he feels like he was used by Hamilton in order to facilitate this deal and pass the Assumption Bill, to which Jefferson really wasn't familiar with because just prior he had been on his tour of duty in France as diplomat. And so he says, not then sufficiently understood by me, and of all the errors of my political life, this has occasioned me the deepest regret. So he's expressing that this is the largest mistake that he's made in his political life. By brokering this deal between Jefferson and Hamilton, he feels like he somehow helped undermine the future of the Republic. Continuing on. It has ever been my purpose to explain this to you, George Washington, when from being actors on the scene, we shall have become uninterested spectators only. So this is obviously frustrating him. The second part of my resolution has been religiously observed with the War Department, and as to that of the Treasury, has never been farther swerved from them by the mere enunciation of my sentiments in conversation, and chiefly among those who, expressing the same sentiments, drew mine from me. If it has been supposed that I ever intrigued among the members of the legislatures to defeat the plans of the Secretary of the Treasury, it is contrary to all truth. So he's defending himself. He's saying, I never explicitly tried to defend against Alexander Hamilton's propositions in the legislature. However, he says, as I never had the desire to influence the members, so neither had I any other means than my friendships, which I valued too highly to risk by usurpations on their freedom of judgment, and the conscientious pursuit of their own state of duty. So again, his non-confrontational personality comes out. He's saying, I never explicitly told these people they were wrong, especially Alexander Hamilton or James Madison or whomever, because he felt that it was not his right to tell them that they were capable of making the judgment on their own. Looking back on it, he could have had influence to change the decision if he felt that it wasn't the right thing to do, but that's not how it went on. So he continues to say, that I have utterly, in my private conversations, disapproved of the system of the Secretary of the Treasury, I acknowledge and avow. And this was not merely a speculative difference. So he obviously had a real problem with Alexander Hamilton's system. It was not merely a speculative difference. He found real issues with this proposition. Assumption. His system flowed from principles adverse to liberty and was calculated to undermine and demolish the Republic by creating an influence of his department over members of the legislature. I saw this influence actually produced and its first fruits to the establishment of the great outlines of his project by the votes of the very persons who, having swallowed his bait, were laying themselves out to profit by his plans, and that had these persons withdrawn as those interested in a question ever should, the vote of the disinterested majority was clearly the reverse of what they made it. So he's basically saying that the plan tricked the majority, that it made it seem like it was going to be good for everybody, and it made it seem like it was going to be the right thing to do, but in reality, it benefited the few, it benefited the speculators, and it really served to set a precedent for big government in America. He continues on. These were no longer the votes, then, of the representatives of the people, but of deserters from the rights and interests of the people, and it was impossible to consider their decisions, which had nothing in view but to enrich themselves, as the measures of the fair majority, which ought always to be respected. He goes on to say, later on in the letter, it was expressly assumed that the general government has a right to exercise all powers which may be for the general welfare, that is to say, all the legitimate powers of government, since no government has the legitimate right to do what is not for the general welfare of the governed. There was indeed a sharp limitation to the universality of this power to cases where money may be employed. So this was only going to be for cases that money could be used. However, he says, but about what is it that money cannot be employed? But about what is it that money cannot be employed? So he's saying, what could you possibly come up with that you could not say, okay, money can fix this? Which today we see that's the argument in a lot of government. I'll just throw more money at it. So, Jefferson was skeptical of Hamilton's plan because he felt It was a move to consolidate power to the federal legislature, by which the financiers and the speculators could buy votes. That's very important because this behavior is something that we deal with today. And whether or not this has helped perpetuate the republic or has hindered progress is up to you, but it is something that he predicted then, and it is a very real problem today. Thank you.